He woke with a gasp. His head throbbed. Disorientation wrapped around him like a shroud. Where was he? The room was dark, illuminated only by a sickly yellow light emanating from a single bulb hanging precariously above. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of mildew and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. He tried to remember how he got here. His mind was a swirling vortex of shadows and half-formed thoughts. Panic welled up in his chest, constricting his throat. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to get out. He ran his hands along the cold, damp walls, desperately searching for a door, a window, anything. But there was nothing, just the smooth, unbroken surface of concrete. He was trapped. He stumbled back towards the center of the room, his gaze falling upon the only other object in the desolate space, an old-fashioned radio, perched upon a rickety wooden chair. It was the kind his grandfather used to have, with a large tuning dial and a speaker covered in faded yellow fabric. A low hum emanated from it, a constant, unsettling drone. He stared at the radio, his breath catching in his throat. The room was eerily silent save for the faint hum emanating from the old device. Was that hum always there? Or had it just started, creeping into his consciousness like a sinister whisper? Or was it growing louder, more insistent? The hum seemed to pulse with a life of its own, filling the room with an unsettling energy. As he watched, the dial began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster. It was as if the radio had a mind of its own, possessed by some unseen force. A crackling static filled the room, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Then, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of his darkest nightmares. A deep, gravelly voice that seemed to slither from the speaker, wrapping around him like a serpent. It was a voice that carried with it a weight of malevolence and dread.
Chuckling. "Ah, you finally woke up!" The voice was mocking, filled with a twisted sense of amusement. "I see you remember me, don't you?" It was a statement, not a question, and it sent a chill down his spine. So many secrets, so many mistakes. The voice seemed to know everything about him, every hidden shame and regret.
He recoiled, stumbling back until his back hit the cold concrete wall. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. The voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. It was a sound that seemed to resonate with the very core of his being. It spoke of things he thought he had long forgotten, childhood secrets, hidden shames, memories he had buried deep within himself, whispers of past mistakes that he had tried to bury deep within the recesses of his mind. Each word from the voice was like a dagger cutting into his soul. How could this thing know these things? His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion.
Mockingly, "You thought you could hide from your past? Silly, silly boy." The voice was relentless, tearing down the walls he had built around his darkest memories.
He pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. He felt trapped, cornered by the voice that seemed to know his every thought. He had to get away from that voice. He had to make it stop. The need to escape was overwhelming, consuming his every thought. He lunged for the radio, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal casing. Desperation fueled his actions. He ripped the cord from the wall, plunging the room into darkness. But the darkness brought no relief. But the voice continued, echoing in the silence, taunting him. It was as if the voice was inside his head, inescapable.
Echoing, "You can't run from me." The voice was a haunting echo reverberating through the darkness. "You can never run from yourself." The final words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the inescapable truth.
The darkness was almost as unbearable as the voice. He huddled on the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing closer with every heartbeat. The silence was broken only by the pounding of his own heart, a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, the memories, the fear that threatened to consume him. Each beat echoed in his ears, a relentless reminder of his torment, but it was no use. The voice was inside his head now, whispering his darkest fears, his deepest regrets. It was a relentless presence, a shadow that clung to his every thought, twisting his reality. It spoke of a crime, a terrible, unforgivable act that he couldn't quite grasp, couldn't quite bring himself to believe. The details were hazy, like a nightmare that fades upon waking. yet the dread it inspired was all too real. He had done something wrong, something very wrong. The voice was certain of it. And the more it spoke, the more he began to doubt himself. His mind was a battleground, each thought a skirmish between denial and acceptance.
Whispering, "You know what you did, you can feel it, can't you? That guilt gnawing at your soul. It won't let you rest, it won't let you forget."
His memories were fragmented, like shards of broken glass. He strained to piece them together to make sense of the swirling chaos in his mind. Each fragment was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. But the harder he tried, the more elusive the truth became. He had to know, he had to remember. The need for clarity was a burning ache, a desperate plea for understanding. But what if he didn't like what he found? What if the truth was more terrifying than the uncertainty? The fear of the unknown was a heavy weight pressing down on his chest.
Softly, "Remember, remember." The voice was a haunting melody, a siren's call that beckoned him to the edge of his sanity.
He didn't know how long he had been trapped in that room, in that nightmare. The days had blurred into nights, and the nights into days, creating an endless loop of despair. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, slipping through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. Days and nights bled into one another, an endless cycle of fear and paranoia. The calendar pages flipped, but he couldn't tell if it was real or just another trick of his mind. The voice was his only companion, his constant tormentor. It whispered secrets and lies, filling his head with doubts and fears. He had long since given up trying to escape. Every attempt was met with failure, every hope dashed against the unyielding walls. There was nowhere to go. The door was locked, the windows barred, and the walls seemed to close in on him. He was trapped, not just within those four walls, but within the prison of his own mind. His thoughts were a labyrinth, each turn leading to more confusion and despair. He began to notice the symbols. At first, they were just faint marks, barely visible in the dim light. They appeared gradually at first, faint etchings on the concrete walls. But as time passed, they became more pronounced, more intricate. Strange, arcane symbols that seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes. They glowed with an eerie light, casting shadows that danced on the walls. He tried to ignore them, to convince himself they were just figments of his imagination. But the more he tried, the more persistent they became. But they persisted, growing larger, more detailed, more menacing. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, mocking his attempts to dismiss them. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers tracing the intricate lines. The symbols felt almost alive, their warmth seeping into his skin. They felt strangely warm to the touch, as if pulsating with a life of their own. The warmth was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder of his isolation. As his fingers moved, the symbols seemed to shift and change, forming new patterns, new meanings that he couldn't quite grasp. It was as if they were trying to communicate something he couldn't understand. He felt a cold dread creep into his heart. The symbols were not just marks on the wall, they were a message, a warning. This place, whatever it was starting to feel less like a prison and more like a puzzle box. Each symbol, each mark was a piece of a larger puzzle, and he was the rat trapped inside, desperately trying to find his way out. The walls spoke to him, but their language was one of madness and despair.